Hello and welcome. It is 10:30. It is the 27th day of March 2021. I am your grumpy guide to all things gaming. Yo GGM. The N in news and nerd. And it is the last days of Megadungeon March. All this month we have been exploring the concept of what goes into building your Megadungeon. And should you have a mega dungeon in your world? I mean, there is something very appealing and attractive about the idea of just this huge, sprawling, ever-changing, massive dungeon. But there's also that's a lot of work, and there's a lot of space, and it doesn't really make sense. And how do I convince people to keep going there? And really, there's not as much allure to them as there used to be in the old days of grinders and mega dungeons. And yet they still keep getting made, so obviously there is some audience there. And there's very few other words that go with March other than Mega Dungeon. So, yeah, let us continue to explore the idea of the Mega Dungeon. Now, this month, instead of focusing on a specific Mega Dungeon build, we've just sort of discussed the various thoughts that, you would go into creating a Mega Dungeon. Who built your Mega Dungeon? Because nobody ever sets out to just build a Mega Dungeon. They set out to do one thing, and then life happens, and things happen, and next thing you know is how did this place get so big? Where did these floating skulls come from? I don't remember putting those in here. I was just trying to build a tower. So yeah, who built it? Why did they build it? What was the original goal? Because often with Mega Dungeons, the original goal and the final product can be two very different things. I mean, Hallister didn't set out to make Undermountain what it was. He was just exploring some caves and some old ruins and investigating, and then just things happened. Where is your Mega Dungeon located? Because a Mega Dungeon in the snow would be completely different than a Mega Dungeon in a swamp, would be completely different than a Mega Dungeon under a city. How does anybody in Waterdeep actually go about life with this thing literally under their feet? I don't know, but it's Waterdeep, so who cares? So obviously the location of the Mega Dungeon is paramount to, what might be going on around the Mega Dungeon and the stories of the world around it and what events lead to the players being there and stuff. Okay. How? How did the Mega Dungeon get from where it was to where it is today? And if we were using our real life example here in California, that is the closest, one of the closest things. We have a few, but UCLA is kind of the closest thing we have to a Mega Dungeon. Disneyland, you could say, is a Mega Dungeon, except Disneyland has a very concrete plan. And you could say, well, like the Winchester Mystery House and Hearst Castle. But again, those are kind of smaller. And again, they had very concrete plans. But UCLA, when you look at it and you look at its history and you look at how far it's scattered around and what actually constitutes UCLA, it's the closest thing I can think of to California to a Mega Dungeon, because it's just sort of a mess, and nobody really knows exactly how large University of California, Los Angeles is, because there's annexes and there's buildings and stuff like that. So how did our Mega Dungeon go from, just whatever it originally was to what it is today? How did Undermountain get to be Undermountain? Because again, that's not what Hallister set out to become. How did the Barrowmaze become the Barrowmaze? Because when the original people were just like, hey, let's just make a graveyard for our dead, Dias de la Muerte, celebrate them once a year. And now it's, Barrowmaze. And how did UCLA become UCLA? Because when UCLA was originally built, it was just an annex to the Los Angeles County Library. And now it's this huge mega conglomeration of structures. It's a Mega Dungeon. So how did your Mega Dungeon go from its beginning to where it is now? Okay. So who, where, why did they build it? How did it happen? What is the iconic features of it? What are the things that stand out? What are the events that lead the player characters to come to the Mega Dungeon? What is it about the Mega Dungeon that wants to inspire player characters to keep returning to it? Okay. Then we discussed, your wandering monsters. What's because wandering monster tables are going to be your best friends in designing, random tables in general, but wandering monster tables specifically in a Undermountain type setting and in a Mega Dungeon type setting, because Mega Dungeons are fluid. They're not static. They constantly change. And whenever there's an opening in the ecology of a mega dungeon. Let's say a bunch of players come in and clear out a couple rooms. Eventually something, much like in real life, is going to move in to fill that opening. Mega dungeons, unlike normal dungeons, are not static. They're constantly growing, they're constantly changing, they're constantly evolving. Then we discussed factions. Factions are these entities, these groups that sort of make up the power structure of your mega dungeon, flux and change and sort of influence. If we're talking Undermountain, factions would be like, Xanther and the guild. And another faction would be Shadow Skullport, and another faction would be Hallister's various apprentices, and another faction might be the people at Stardock. If we're talking UCLA and our factions, what's our UCLA? Well, in our factions of UCLA, we would have like UCLA Sports would definitely be a one faction. UCLA Academics would be another faction. UCLA Administration would be a third faction. UCLA Medical would be another faction. So yeah, we have factions, and those factions change. So today we're going to address. I used to have a brain. Address the ideas. Does your mega dungeon have a big bad or just lots of little bads? So like Barrowmaze does have a big bad at the end. So technically there is an end goal to Barrowmaze. You may never reach it, but there is a big bad at the very end. Considering it's, Barrowmaze is very undead centric. Obviously the big bad at the end is probably a lich or a lich dragon or something like that. I'm not going to give it away because spoilers, but yeah. Now it might take years to reach that big bad and you might never see it because Barrowmaze is completely independent of the fact, but there is a big bad. And taking out that big bad would change the very structure of Barrowmaze. On the other hand, Undermountain doesn't really have a big bad. I mean, sure, there's Hallister, but he's not really a bad guy, and he's not really actively doing anything other than perpetuating Undermountain. Hallister is just sort of a force of nature. He could show up and help you. He could show up and harm you. He could show up and not care about you whatsoever and literally do things around you and completely ignore you because, when Hallister is in Undermountain, he is all powerful. He's basically, for the lack of a better term, the god of Undermountain. But he's not paramount to the story of Undermountain. Undermountain has lots of little bads, like Xanther, that the player characters would actively be dealing with. But there's no really central big bad at the center of all of Undermountain going, I can't understand why the people in Waterdeep hasn't noticed us yet. We're literally under their feet. So yes, Undermountain would be a perfect example of lots of little bads. And if we're using our UCLA, then would the head administrator of the board of directors of UCLA be the big bad? Would taking out that guy make any drastic changes, or would UCLA as an entity continue and somebody else would just fill? So, there's like one major, if UCLA is a mega dungeon, then if there is a pinnacle high individual, but taking him out wouldn't really make that much of a difference to UCLA as a whole because there's so many things that keep the heart of UCLA pumping that taking out that guy would make very little difference. So, yeah. Those are the three examples. So things to consider. Is there a center? Is there a brain? Is there a great mastermind at the center to your Undermountain, your mega dungeon? And if that individual, if she is taken out, how would that affect the mega dungeon? How easy it is of the player characters to get to there? Do the player characters even know about it at first, or do they not find out about it for like 10 years? Is your big bad kind of like extremely instrumental to the entity of your mega dungeon? Would taking out the big bad completely change the environment? If somebody could kill Hallister, how would that affect Undermountain? He is sort of the heart and soul of Undermountain. On the other hand, if you took out the big bad of Barrowmaze, it would change it drastically, but it's still sort of, it would go through a slow process of change, and certain aspects would have shut down, but other aspects wouldn't really be affected. But, taking out Hallister, if you could, would definitely make a drastic change to Undermountain, but he's not really the major, thing that keeps adventurers going to Undermountain. And if you took out the head of UCLA, the dean of students or the head of the UCLA board of directors, if you took him out, UCLA would still keep going, because then you'd have to work your way through everybody else and all the deans and the department heads and the CEOs and the corporation. And UCLA, you couldn't really stop UCLA. You could change it, but you couldn't stop it. If you took out Hollister, you would drastically change Undermountain. There would be definite, chaotic, catastrophic changes almost instantly. But if you took out the big bad at, like, say, Barrowmaze, there would be changes, but they would be slow and drastic. And, I mean, it would be like a long winter. There would definitely be changes, but they wouldn't happen overnight. You might not even notice some of the changes. On the other changes might be really drastic, and you'd notice them right away. Barrowmaze as an entity would change, but it's still, yeah. So these are all things to think about. If we're, which one works best? Should the computer of your Megadungeon have a central hard drive that could feasibly be approachable to the player characters at some point in time and dealt with at some point in time? And then, if that is a thing, what would happen to your Megadungeon? On the other hand, does your Megadungeon sort of just have lots of independent individuals who are sort of responsible for the life and blood flow of the Megadungeon? And if you took one of these, mini bads out, there would be changes, but the Megadungeon as a whole would still be there. Because let's face it, even if you took Hollister out, even after all the chaotic, catastrophic disasters that would befall Megadungeon, Undermountain, that's still a lot of real estate. And, it's still a lot of aspects that still need to be dealt with. It would still take years and years and years, even if you took Hollister out, to deal with every single solitary thing that is prowling around in all that space, and find a way to make that real estate not dangerous to yourself. So even then, there would still be something that is Undermountain, even if you took out the big bad. So, yeah, things to think about. Now, if I was building a Megadungeon, I don't know if I'd have a big bad at the center. And I don't know if, the player characters would be able to, destroy the dungeon. I mean, anything's possible with enough wishes, I suppose, or a nuclear bomb. But I think I like the idea of just sort of like, independent. There's a brain, there's a heart, there's lungs, there's independent things that keep the Megadungeon going, but if one of them's taken out, it would be drastic and catastrophic, but the Megadungeon would still eventually recover and keep going. It just wouldn't be what it was before. I think that's probably the best, because, unless you do have access to like enough wishes or a nuclear bomb or the ability to just flood the entire place with an ocean, which I guess you could do, especially Undermountain. I mean, it would take a while, but you could just completely flood it out. Then it would be Undersea Undermountain. I don't know. I am your grumpy guide to all things gaming. If you appreciate this content, let me know. If you don't appreciate this content, let me know. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. Help me hit 500 subs by August 4th. Remember, there's a contest going on for our 400th sub. We'll win a little prize package that we've got behind me there. And, till next time, enjoy creating your own personal Undermountain Megadungeon adventure, and let me know about it. Comment down below. Let me know about your Megadungeon hopes and dreams and plans. And then, otherwise, I'm tired, so get off my lawn.